So our next session is how an accounting solutions firm drives 40% of its business from email. Joining me now is Div Bansal, Vice President of Marketing for Accountants World. Thanks for joining us, Div.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
So tell us a bit about your background and what you do at Accountants World.
Sure. I've been in marketing for 15 years now, and I've worked primarily at online companies. I started Accountants World about 6-7 years ago, and I'm the head of marketing at Accountants World, and what we focus on is getting our message out to professional accountants, the 200,000 professional accountants across the country, and making them aware of what we do, both in terms of content and in terms of software solutions as well.
And speaking of your experience, we've documented it on MarketingSherpa somewhat. So this is not your first case study. Back in 2004, I see you did a case study with MarketingSherpa. So how has email changed since those days?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say when I first saw that you were going to put this slide in, I had like real pride thinking back about what my team and I were doing back in 2004. And then not so much pride when I realized that some of the attendees here were probably in elementary school when that happened. But back in 2004, we were looking at, the case study was primarily about the integration of a website, particularly with the homepage and email, and how to synthesize those two together. And so our project at that time was to revamp the website to support the email efforts that we were doing and try to optimize sort of the ways in which those two complemented each other.
Something we're still facing today in many ways, right? So, all right, let's get into Accountants World. So, how does Accountants World serve its? So, Accountants World, that's a theme park for accountants, right? Is that how does it serve its customers?
So, Accountants World has been around since 2001. We were the pioneer in cloud-based software solutions for professional accountants. As I mentioned before, there are about 200,000 of those accountants across the country, and their clientele is small businesses. So, small businesses take their tax and accounting and payroll work to the accountants that we serve. And so there's two primary ways in which we serve our customer differently than our competitors do. Number one is that our mantra is that we put accountants first, and I know that sounds like the most obvious marketing slogan. We try to actually live it, and one of the ways we live that is that we never sell our solutions directly to the small business clients. We only sell them to accountants who can then rebrand it, and you see that up on the top there. They can private label it and put their name out there rather than our name. And the other part is that all of our solutions were built for the cloud from the ground up. So they weren't converted from desktop or some other system. And so the amount of collaboration they have is more advanced than anywhere else.
I'd say another way you put accountants first is with your newsletter. From looking at it, it's very customer focused. And tell us a little bit about how you built that newsletter up.
Sure. The newsletter was one of the first things that Accountants World created. It's about 13, 14 years old at this point. And the goal of the newsletter was to provide objective content out to the accounting community. So we're pulling content from accounting media, we're pulling content from financial media. Some of the content is organic and we've written it ourselves and then publish it there. And at this point, we address probably about a third of the marketplace within the scope of the newsletter base. So we have about 75,000 to 80,000 active subscribers to it. And it's really our leading way to be able to provide value to the accounting industry. We're much, much smaller than most of our competitors. We have much smaller brand name than a company like Intuit or Thomson Reuters. Those are multi-billion-dollar companies. And so the newsletter is sort of our way in the door to start to have a conversation with our ideal customer.
Yeah, and I don't want to gloss over that, because those are some really powerful numbers Div just mentioned. Right, that's some outsized influence. These competitors are 50 to 100 times bigger than you, and you have a third of the addressable market. That is really impressive. So let's take a look at how you grew that list to get that influence. So when we talked, I was like, okay, what is the big difference between this email and what other people are sending?
Yeah, I think there's two primary advantages we've had in terms of building this. One of which is replicable, and one of which maybe not so much. So the not so much one, we just had first mover advantage. We got in there earlier than almost anyone else who was doing this type of newsletter for this particular vertical. So that certainly helped us accelerate the growth and grow in terms of word of mouth. But I think the other advantage that we've had is that we strike the right balance between objectivity and really understanding the customer. So we have competitors like Intuit and Thomson who put out newsletters themselves, but their newsletters are really just glorified advertorials for their solutions. If they talk about customers in there, it's their customers and they're mentioning Intuit solutions or Thomson solutions throughout that newsletter. And we think there's a place for that in terms of marketing emails, but what we want to do was provide something that was much more objective and that was linking to content that really could help the accountants on a daily basis. On the other hand, there are industry publications like Accounting Today and the AICPA, which is the American Institute of CPAs. They put out newsletters, and they are great in terms of being objective, but the problem is that they have a certain amount of distance from accountants. They're not talking to practicing accountants every single day about what their solution or what their problems are that they're facing, what emerging challenges they're seeing with their clients, and we are. So what we can do is strike the right balance there between having content that's more hard-hitting than the more sort of academic, conceptual industry publications, but more objective than some of our competitors are putting out there.
And one way you learn about what your customers want is through surveys?
Absolutely. So if we see here on the bottom right, we did a survey. We do these sorts of surveys continually, but the biggest one we did was about 5 years ago. And our stance is that QuickBooks has been really bad for the accounting profession because it allows small businesses who don't know anything about accounting to go buy a piece of software, start to do accounting themselves, and then they're wondering, well, what is my professional accountant doing? And the answer is they're cleaning up all the messes that you made when you were using QuickBooks. So that's our stance, and we know that there are many accountants who agree with that and many who disagree. And so we put out a one-question poll that simply asked, did QuickBooks break client accounting? And we promoted this heavily through print, digital, e-blast, basically every forum that we possibly could. And we had over 5,700 responses to this, and what was really amazing is 2,600 of those people chose to go ahead and put in an optional text response as well because they wanted so much to talk about this issue. So two things we realized from there. Number one, this is a real hot button issue on both sides. We had a lot of pro and a lot of con there. We were really onto something in terms of the topic. The other part is we looked at the language that people were using when they were saying, yes, I agree that QuickBooks has been a negative influence on the industry, and the words that they were using there have funneled directly into our newsletter and other marketing that we've done since then.
So it's great to hit a customer pain point that's square on the head, but did that generate any controversy or any negative backlash from that?
Yeah, so as soon as it went out, we heard from Intuit's lawyers.
Big company, a lot of lawyers.
Right, exactly, lots and lots of lawyers. And we talked to them and said, this is a totally objective survey. We're not sort of slanting it, and they backed down from it. And actually, what was really great is not only did the industry media cover the fact that we were doing this survey, but then they talked about the fact that Intuit was not happy with us about this, which gave it another set of run from there as well. So it actually ended up being, I think, really good for us just in terms of we're raising this question, regardless of which side you're on about there.
It's a great David versus Goliath play.
Yeah.
So list cleansing, something that was really interesting when we talked about your list cleansing is that you really got an understanding of the seasonality of your customers.
Yeah, we tend to be, if you talk to a lot of the email providers out here, in terms of best practices for list cleansing, we are much more conservative in list cleansing than most email providers would recommend. And the reason is that accounting is a very, very seasonal business. And so, for example, right now, in early to mid-April, our sales team could contact every single prospect on their list, and they won't get anybody to pick up the phone on them. Why? Because tax day is 6 days away, right? So every accountant is busy working on taxes. So many of our accountants will go 3.5 months never really opening our newsletter and then have really high engagement throughout the rest of the year. So we can't simply say, if you haven't engaged with us in 90 days or 180 days, we're going to take you off the list. We have to be much more conservative than that. So what we've been doing is periodically sending out emails to people who haven't engaged in a very long period of time, typically about 9 months or so, and simply ask them, would you like to disengage from here? Simply click here if you'd like to opt out. And what we find is very few people actually go ahead and do that. Very few people use that button. Very few people unsubscribe from the newsletter on a daily basis. So accountants are comfortable with the fact that I may check out for a long period of time, but I know that you're there as a trusted resource when I'm ready for more information.
Okay, so now we see how Div built his email list. We see the power and the influence that comes with very effective content, but also, and we've heard this from other brands too, that have very effective content that's very unbiased. There's this major challenge they face, and what was that challenge you faced?
Yeah, we found that consistently, when people heard Accountants World, they would say, oh, I love your newsletter. You guys do software too? And so we'd hear this at conferences, we'd hear this on sales calls as well. People loved our content, but they had no opinion about our software because they weren't even aware necessarily that we sold our software. So an aha moment was, well, we've got this great resource that we can leverage in terms of the newsletter. We can use that to promote, But we have to be very careful because clearly the reason people are engaging with that newsletter is for objective content. And so we can't make it an advertorial piece. We can't make it 50% our content. It has to continue to slant very much in the direction of our prospects' expectations.
Yeah, so you started by mindfully adding branded content. So let's take a look at that. And how did you find that balance there?
Yeah, so you'll see right there the top story on our newsletter. That used to be right at the top of the newsletter when it was first released. We'd have a top story, 3 additional stories, and then a list of more targeted stories by function. And so the change that we made is to put in 3 banner placements, and we tested where those should be and so on. And we ended up with 3 banner placements, a 728 right at the top, a 468 on the left-hand side, and then a smaller banner that we use on the bottom right to promote webinars and events and so on. And we don't just use that to promote ourselves. About 25% of the time, we're selling that space to other companies who are interested in getting out in front of tax and payroll accountants. We even will sell that space to our competitors, as long as they're not discussing a product that is directly competitive with us. So we don't sell tax software. If a tax software company wants to promote their tax software, we're totally fine with that as well. So in the 75% of the time that we're using that space at the top, a simplistic way to look at it would be we're just promoting our products, but most often what we're doing is promoting content that will then lead them down the path to understanding what our products can do at that point. So you'll see examples there, 2 different examples. One of them has Accountants World branding, one of them doesn't. And that's because we know that our payroll relief solution, which is for payroll processing, is our most well-known product. And so we sometimes let that brand stand on its own. It can get marketed to people other than accountants as well, other payroll professionals. But anything else that we promote, whether it's corporate branding or product branding, we're always putting the Accountants World brand out there.
Okay, so that's the first step of the customer journey, but let's look at the whole conversion path. So what are some of the conversion paths that you send customers on after they click?
Sure. So we have 2 different conversion starting points here. One is via ebook and one is via webinar. And so the way we think about it is our newsletter is basically 100% content, except for 3 ad placements. The actual content in there itself is pretty much 100% objective. Our ebooks are a little bit further down the line of being a little bit more branded. So most of our ebooks tend to be 7 to 10 pages in length, very easily digestible, very simple language. And then typically on the last 2 to 3 pages of the ebook, we'll start to make a transition from being conceptual and talking about an issue or a challenge that accountants face to talking about us and how we help to solve that challenge. And then there'll be a next steps page right at the end, which is directly saying, here's what we can do for you, here's a webinar you should attend, here's a number that you should call up at that point. So that's the ebook path, and then from the ebook, we can drive people to a webinar at that point or to our product pages. If we drive them directly to a webinar, which is what we see up on the top there, our webinars are typically about 50-50 in terms of being conceptual versus informational about our solutions. Typically that 50% that's about us will be a straight product demo. So we start with a concept and then we go to how our product will solve that. And a really cool thing that we've seen on the newsletter is we get just about identical CTRs on the front end from both of those. So there are people who are ready to have that conversation about how can you help me solve this problem. There are other people who are looking to talk about the problem and just get a sense of what the broad scope of it is.
So it's a great way to shortcut some of those people right to the solution. Right?
Absolutely. Choose path 1, 2, or 3, whichever one is appropriate for you.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those webinars for just a moment. So there we see the entire path. So you start 100% content, and as you're walking people more through, you get more into the product. So those webinars have been very effective for you. Tell us about that evergreen webinar process you have set up.
Sure. So we originally conceived of the webinars as a completely separate path from our ebooks, and then what we found over time was a lot of the content was overlapping there. And so we created that sequence of sort of ebooks to webinars to product discussions. The webinars have really allowed us to not only identify the people who are ready to discuss solutions right now and get on a sales call, but it's also allowed us to identify people who may be warm but not quite hot at this point in terms of our interaction. So every one of our webinars ends with at least one survey question, potentially multiple survey questions, which helps us identify, should we send you down a sales path right now? Should we send you down a nurturing path where you can self-identify for more information, such as pricing information, case studies, testimonials, etc.? Or are you simply not interested? You attended this webinar, you may have nodded along to the part about the content, but you don't agree that we're the right solution for you at this time. And so it gives us some very clear pathing for our sales team. One of the things that's done is our sales team is actually interacting with fewer people now, but they're getting much better, more interested people on the phone.
That's what we ultimately want.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about how you use some essentially ads in the newsletter, but you rebranded the newsletter itself, and this is pretty subtle, but what did you do right here?
Yeah, this was an idea that our CEO came up with about 6 months ago, and he was saying, look, we continue to have an issue where the broad community doesn't necessarily know that we provide cloud solutions. They still know us more for the newsletter. And so we said, why don't we just put this right up front and center? And so we switched from Accountants World Daily News to Accountants Daily News by Accountants World, the leader in cloud solutions for accountants. And that also links through to our solutions page as well. So that was a really subtle thing that we wanted to test. And because we have a really large scope in terms of our subscribership and we get a good open rate every single day, typically instead of running A/B tests, what we'll typically do is just do it on sequential days. So we'll run it on a Wednesday and a Thursday on a particular week and then switch them up on the following week. And we're going to get enough statistical significance there to be able to see what's working. And we've anecdotally, it's very early at this point, but anecdotally we've started to get some really good feedback on having our brand there associated with software solutions and not just the newsletter.
Okay. And so that's speaking your language to the customers to make sure the customer understands what you do. You've also got very good at speaking the customer's language. So we talked about that survey example in the beginning. Can you show us how you use that survey to actually affect your sales copy?
Sure. So what we see on the bottom left here was a direct quote from one of the survey respondents when we asked them what they thought about QuickBooks. And this is clearly a person who said, no, I do not like QuickBooks. And so what was great is we did a word scan on all the 2,600 comments that came in, split them up in terms of positive and negative. We looked at the comments that were sort of anti-QuickBooks, and we kept on seeing words like messes that my clients make, or hassle, or the stress of cleaning up, or things like that. We've now taken, or bookkeeping errors, we've taken those terms and consistently applied them not only on our website copy and our landing page copy, but also in terms of what we write into our ebooks, what we put in our webinar descriptions. We've written them into even things like the on-hold text that we have on our phone system. So we're trying to make sure that we're mirroring exactly what our customers are saying there. I think this is a great case where if we had simply been testing out copy that we thought of ourselves internally without getting feedback from clients, we would have consistently been A/B testing different combinations of words that would have never gotten as close as what the customers told us in one survey.
You can't just randomly A/B test it. It makes a difference what you're A/B testing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so you incorporated social media into this as well. So one of the things we see there is that LinkedIn ad, 19,000 accountants follow us. That's a consistent ad in the right-hand banner of your email newsletter?
Yeah, we use that quite frequently in the bottom right of our newsletter. And actually, what's great is this was pulled, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we just had our designer update that because we've gone, since that time, since the beginning of the year, we've gone from 19,000 to 27,000 following us on LinkedIn. So we continue to post on Twitter and on Facebook, but LinkedIn has been by far the most valuable for us and for the professional accountants who are our audience as well. Our posts on LinkedIn range from, sometimes it's a direct copy of the things that we're posting into our newsletter, if we found things there. Sometimes it's earned media coverage of Accountants World. This is a good place for us to post that, obviously. And sometimes it's stories that are more tangentially related to accounting or accountants across the web. So there was something on CNET yesterday about tax scams and tax refund scams. So we're going to be posting that up today with kind of a little bit of a spin on what accountants can tell their clients about that. My marketing coordinator talks about our LinkedIn content as being sort of Accountants World after hours, where we can be a little bit more casual when we want to be, but we can also mirror the content that we're posting elsewhere when we want to be as well. So we're seeing this real synergy between what we're doing on the newsletter and being able to post on there and get people over to LinkedIn, as well as being able to drive the other way as well. So eventually what we want to do is get many more of our 80,000 newsletter subscribers to be following us on LinkedIn, and also get more of our LinkedIn followers reading the newsletter every day as well.
Great. So let's look at the overall results from this effort.
Yep. So since we started this really focused strategy on the newsletter of promoting ourselves, but in a very, very careful, methodical way, We've seen a 12% increase in newsletter subscribers. We've seen an 8% increase in new sales, and I think we'll see that come up. Accounting software tends to have a really long consideration cycle, so we haven't necessarily seen the full effect of that newsletter subscriber base growing. But the thing that I'm most impressed with is in terms of content consumption, 15% increase in our webinar participation, and 5,000 plus ebook downloads over the course of the last 9 or 10 months since we implemented this strategy. So I think what we're seeing is that we've really gotten far ahead in terms of conquering how do we get people to our content, and now we can work on stage 2, which is how do we make that transition from content to sales as effective as possible. But I'm really excited about what we've been able to do on the front end there.
Congratulations, very
Thanks.
nice. Well, what's the one? Actually, if you have any questions, raise your hand. We'll have some mics come around. You can ask a different question. What's the one top takeaway you'd give to other marketers?
Yeah, I think one insight that we've had going through this process is I think we as marketers tend to have a really simplistic definition of what data we're collecting in terms of our customers, and especially in terms of testing for email, for newsletters, et cetera. I think our definition of data that we're collecting needs to be a little bit broader. It's not just the really quantifiable things that we can split test or that we can see that our competitors are doing and sort of mirror from there. We're seeing things that are coming in from survey results. We're seeing things that are coming in from sales interactions. We're seeing things that happen at conferences. Those have always been there, but now we're putting much more of a conscious effort on saying, how do we sort of productize all of that feedback and bring it back in bundles that our marketing team can really use and incorporate in. So if we can be 6 to 9 months ahead of our competitors in terms of the terminology we're using and in terms of the way that we're connecting with our customers, I think that gives us a huge advantage, despite the fact that we're a lot smaller than they are.
You said productize, because I assume the email newsletter is a product for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We think of it like any of our other products in terms of it has to provide value on a regular basis and it has to be measurable.
Okay. Any questions for Div? Okay, well, you can meet Div, get some ideas for cutting through the clutter in your inbox. Oh, we have one in the back? Oh, right there. Sorry, the lights are pretty bright.
Okay, thank you for a good explanation of what you did. Previous speaker told us about the fun style of communicating with customers, and they're also in financial sector working. What about your attitude to this? Do you like fun style of communication, like jokes and like regular communication between people? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the question was in terms of the style that we use and the tone that we're using in terms of communication. I think what we try to define is a specific style that we want to use for every different type of content. So for example, on LinkedIn, we use definitely a more casual style than we would in our newsletter or our ebooks. Our ebooks tend to be conversational, but also, I would say, sort of terminology heavy, where if you got to an ebook of ours, you're not just someone walking in off the street. You understand the issues in the accounting industry. You know how they relate to you. And so we can be very terminology rich there, but still very casual in our tone. And then our webinar tone tends to be more technical. If you got to our webinars, what you're looking for at that point is not simply an explanation of the what, you're looking for a how and why, right? How can I solve this specific problem? And so the language and tone that we're using there tends to be much more specific. I tell our webinar speakers to actually be a little bit more geeky, right? Like you know the terminology really, really well, and you're speaking to an audience that does as well. So don't be afraid to really put that out there. So we do that there in a way that we wouldn't on LinkedIn or on our email newsletter. So I think of it as sort of a tiered level of style or tone.
I think it's also great to have these two case studies back to back because Simple is very B2C oriented. They're looking to disrupt the financial industry, and so they're definitely looking to take a different approach. In accounting world, B2B, I assume, partly being a smaller company, you're also wanting to show the trustworthiness of your software. It's very important to you.
Right, exactly. And most of our competitors are very official sounding in everything that they put out there. We want to still sound authoritative and professional, but we also realize we're the smaller company. We should act like it, and so our tone should also reflect that as well.
Be a little human.
Yep, exactly.
Any other questions? So, okay, great. Well, you can talk more to Div and learn about cutting through the clutter in your inbox in Roundtable 34. Div will be hosting that. And thank you very much, Div.
Absolutely. Thank you.